In this episode, we're going to tackle a topic that sits underneath almost every modern sign-in experience, but is easy to overlook until something goes wrong: trust relationships. When people first learn identity, they often focus on the user's experience of logging in. Yet the deeper question is why one system should believe another system's claims about who the user is and what they are allowed to do. A trust relationship is that agreement, whether it is explicit and documented or implicit and risky, and it can exist inside one organization or across multiple organizations. Federated identity architectures depend heavily on trust relationships because one domain often relies on another domain to authenticate a user and provide identity information. Standalone identity architectures also depend on trust relationships, but the trust is more contained, often living inside a single identity store and its associated applications. For beginners, this topic can feel abstract, but it becomes very practical when you realize that trust defines who can issue identity assertions, who can accept them, and what happens when the trust is abused. By the end, you should be able to describe what a trust relationship is, how it is built and maintained, why it can fail, and how to reason about trust differently in federated versus standalone designs. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A reliable way to approach trust relationships is to define trust as a security decision, not a feeling. In identity architecture, trust means one system accepts another system's statement as true enough to act on, such as accepting that a user has authenticated or that a user belongs to a certain group. That acceptance is never free, because if the asserting system is wrong or compromised, the relying system may grant access incorrectly. So trust has to be scoped, limited, and backed by verification mechanisms. Verification mechanisms include things like cryptographic signatures, certificates, and shared configuration. But the bigger picture is that trust must be anchored in something you can validate. Beginners sometimes assume that because two systems are connected, they automatically trust each other. But connection is not trust, and trust is not all or nothing. A system might trust another system to authenticate users, but not trust it to define authorization roles. It might trust another system only for a specific application, not for the entire environment. Thinking in scopes is one of the most important architectural habits because it prevents a small trust relationship from quietly becoming a broad backdoor. Once you internalize that trust is a controlled decision, you can design it rather than inheriting it. Standalone identity architectures are easier to picture because they often involve a single identity source and the applications that rely on it. In a standalone design, the identity system is the authority, and the trust relationships are mostly internal. The applications trust the identity system, and the identity system trusts its own data and processes. That does not mean it is simple, because even standalone systems have trust boundaries, such as between the identity store and the application, between administrators and identity configuration, and between the identity system and its backups. However, standalone architectures tend to keep trust within one administrative domain, meaning one organization controls the policy, the identity data, and the authentication methods. This can reduce complexity because you have fewer external parties to coordinate with, and it can reduce risk because you can enforce consistent governance. The limitation is that standalone designs can become isolated islands that require duplicate accounts and separate authentication experiences for different services. They can also create pressure to reuse credentials across systems, which is unsafe. Architects evaluate standalone designs by asking whether the environment's boundaries are stable and whether a single authority can realistically serve all the needed applications. For beginners, the key point is that standalone identity can be strong when the environment is contained, but it can become inefficient and insecure when the organization needs to connect widely. Federated identity architectures exist because organizations and services often need to connect across boundaries without duplicating identities everywhere. Federation means one domain, often called an identity provider, authenticates the user, and another domain, often called a service provider, accepts that authentication, and grants access. The trust relationship is what makes this possible. The service provider trusts the identity provider to perform authentication correctly and to assert identity attributes accurately. Federation can work within a single organization, such as between business units, and it can work across organizations, such as between a company and a cloud service. The advantage is that the user can use a consistent identity while accessing many services, and the organization can centralize authentication controls like MFA. The limitation is that you are now depending on a chain of trust that crosses administrative boundaries, and that chain can fail in ways that are harder to see. If the identity provider is compromised, many downstream services may be exposed. If the trust configuration is wrong, users may gain access they should not have. Architects therefore treat Federation trust as a high-value decision that needs careful scoping, monitoring, and lifecycle management. For beginners, the helpful framing is that Federation is powerful because it lets identity travel, but the risk is that mistakes and compromises travel with it. To define trust relationships well, you need to understand what is being trusted, because trust can apply to different claims. One claim is authentication, meaning the user successfully proved their identity to the identity provider. Another claim is attributes, meaning the user has certain characteristics like department, role, or clearance. A third claim is session context, meaning how recently authentication occurred or whether additional verification was used. In many designs, the service provider uses these claims to make access decisions, which means the service provider is effectively trusting the identity provider's view of the user. Architects therefore decide which claims should be accepted and which claims should be verified locally. For example, an application might trust the identity provider to authenticate the user, but might not trust it to determine fine-grained permissions within the application. It might use Federation for sign-in, but still enforce access based on application-specific roles stored locally. Another application might trust certain high-level group attributes, but only from specific trusted sources. This selective trust reduces risk because it prevents attribute misuse from becoming full authorization control. It also improves auditability because you can explain which system is responsible for which decisions. For beginners, the key is to see trust as layered. Authentication trust, attribute trust, and authorization trust are related but distinct. Trust relationships also have a life cycle, and this is where many architectures quietly drift into danger. A trust relationship is not a one-time setup. It must be maintained through certificate changes, endpoint changes, policy changes, and organizational changes. Certificates expire, keys must be rotated, and configuration must be updated safely without breaking access. If you do not plan for that life cycle, you can create outages when trust suddenly fails, or worse, you can create windows where weak trust is accepted because teams are desperate to restore access. Federation trust often depends on signing keys used to protect assertions, and rotating those keys safely is essential. Similarly, standalone identity often depends on internal keys and certificates for authentication and for securing communications. Architects design processes for updating trust anchors, testing changes, and rolling back safely if something breaks. They also design monitoring for trust events, such as unexpected changes to trust configuration or unusual assertion patterns. For beginners, it is helpful to think of trust like a contract that must be renewed and verified regularly. If you never check the contract again, you may not notice that the terms have changed or that someone forged a signature. Another essential concept is the trust boundary, meaning where control ends and where reliance on another party begins. In a standalone architecture, the trust boundary is often the point where the identity system's assertions reach the applications. In a federated architecture, there are often multiple trust boundaries, such as between an organization and a cloud service, or between two partner organizations. Architects define these boundaries so they can manage risk, because risk management is different inside your boundary than outside it. Inside your boundary, you can enforce controls and investigate issues with direct authority. Outside your boundary, you have to rely on contracts, shared responsibilities, and negotiated processes. This affects how much you trust external attributes, how you handle incidents, and how quickly you can respond if a partner's identity system is compromised. Trust boundaries also affect privacy, because sharing identity attributes across boundaries can expose personal data. Architects therefore apply data minimization to federation, sharing only what the service needs. For beginners, the main idea is that trust boundaries are where assumptions change, and good design makes those changes explicit rather than hidden. A common beginner misconception is that federation automatically increases security because it enables single sign-on and central authentication controls. Federation can improve security, but it can also increase blast radius if not designed carefully. Centralizing authentication means that a compromise of the identity provider can expose many services at once. It also means that misconfigurations can have broad impact, such as mistakenly issuing overly permissive attributes. Standalone designs can have smaller blast radius, but they often encourage password reuse and inconsistent controls across applications, which is also risky. The architect's job is not to declare one model better, but to define trust in a way that balances usability, manageability, and risk. For example, you might federate authentication but keep application-specific authorization local, limiting what federation can grant. You might use multiple trust relationships for different risk tiers, keeping high-risk services on a tighter trust model. You might enforce stronger verification for privileged access even if standard user access is federated. These choices help ensure federation's convenience does not create a single giant point of failure. For beginners, the takeaway is that security depends on how trust is scoped, not on whether federation exists. Incident response planning is tightly connected to trust relationships because identity systems are high-value targets and federation links many systems together. If you suspect identity provider compromise, you need a plan for how to limit damage quickly, such as revoking trust or restricting high-risk access paths. In standalone designs, that might mean disabling certain accounts or tightening authentication. In federated designs, it might mean temporarily disabling federation for certain services or forcing step-up verification for all users. These are disruptive actions, so you want them to be deliberate and rehearsed rather than improvised. Trust relationships also influence forensic analysis because you need to understand where authentication actually happened and which system asserted which attributes. If logs are incomplete or identifiers are inconsistent, investigations become slow and uncertain. Architects therefore design logging and correlation across trust boundaries, ensuring that both the asserting side and the relying side can reconstruct events. They also define responsibilities with partners so incident communication is clear. For beginners, the key point is that trust relationships are not only design time concerns. They are operational realities that shape how you respond when something goes wrong. Governance is the final piece that makes trust relationships sustainable because trust decisions must be controlled, reviewed, and auditable. Governance includes who is allowed to create or modify trust relationships, how changes are approved, and how the organization verifies that trusts remain appropriate over time. In federated environments, governance often includes agreements about which attributes are shared, how they are validated, and what security controls the identity provider must enforce. In standalone environments, governance includes controlling who can modify identity policies and who can create privileged accounts. Both models need periodic review because trusts that were appropriate when a project started may become risky later if systems change or if the partner relationship changes. Governance also includes technical hygiene, such as ensuring trust configuration is not copied casually between environments and ensuring that test trusts do not leak into production. Beginners sometimes think governance is paperwork, but in identity architecture it is the mechanism that keeps trust from expanding unchecked. Without governance, trust becomes informal and invisible, which is where major security failures begin. The goal is to make trust explicit, limited, and reviewable so it remains a controlled feature rather than an accidental vulnerability. Defining trust relationships for federated and standalone identity architectures is about making deliberate choices about who can vouch for identity, what claims are accepted, and how those claims are protected and governed over time. Standalone architectures concentrate trust within one administrative domain, which can simplify control but can also lead to isolated identity islands if not designed thoughtfully. Federated architectures allow identities to travel across boundaries, enabling single sign-on and centralized authentication controls, but they require careful scoping because the blast radius of mistakes and compromises can be larger. In both models, architects must define trust boundaries, decide which claims are trusted, and plan for the lifecycle of trust anchors like keys and certificates. They must also design monitoring, incident response actions, and governance processes that keep trust relationships correct and auditable as environments evolve. When you can explain trust as a scoped, verifiable, and maintained relationship rather than a vague assumption, you are thinking like an ISSAP architect. The deeper lesson is that identity systems do not only authenticate users, they establish a chain of belief, and security depends on keeping that chain tight, visible, and resilient.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.